All right, so let's talk about the last of the IP types. We're going to talk about ISFPs, those who lead with authenticity and pair it with sensation. So it's the last in the rightness quadrant of the firm model. So just like INFPs, leading with authenticity, it is very much about figuring out what feels right to you based on your emotional experience. All right. So it's very fine grained with emotions. It's very introspective. It's got that reluctant hero component, and it tends to be very idealistic because it's attached to what feels right to them subjectively. So since we've talked about authenticity a lot with the INFP, I more want to talk about how it's paired with sensation. Now, the way that authenticity works with sensation is that sensation is about engagement with the outer world in real time. It's very kinesthetic. It's about being inside the body. Now, what's interesting about authenticity, and this doesn't apply as much for INFPs because INFPs using an intuitive process are better with communicating to other people concepts, all right? The intuitive process is almost always better at mastering abstractions to be able to communicate them. But with ISFPs, because they pair it with sensation and not exploration or intuitive process, they struggle with having language for what's going on inside of them. It's very difficult for them to articulate the nuanced feelings they're experiencing because feelings are an abstraction, all right? And abstraction is not the world that they feel the best in. So what ends up happening is in order to communicate the individual experience of what's going on inside of them, in order to communicate what's really happening inside, they pair it with something that can be experienced by other people in the outside world. And that's what we call art, right? Paintings, music, food, sculptures, pottery, right? It's a matter of creating a piece of art that is kinesthetic, that is physical, and the art itself is a transference or a communication for an emotion, all right, or a series of emotions, or the complexity of emotions. Authenticity is about replicating an emotional experience within yourself and in another person. And remember before when we talked about the difference between authenticity and harmony, it's not about empathy, it's about sympathy. It's about figuring out your expression of that emotion. You're not taking on somebody else's emotion, you're figuring out what that emotion means to you as an individual on a deeply personal level. So this expression isn't to express, like, if I'm feeling sad and I create artwork, I'm not trying to get you to feel my sadness. I'm trying to get you to feel your sadness. What does your sadness look like? How can you process your sadness? Sometimes art is the only way to do it. Beautiful pieces of music, touching and moving poetry, right? Now, an ISFP is more likely to be a writer, even of poetry, but they're more likely to be a novelist, all right? That's a lot more likely for an INFP to express their emotions in that way by creating narratives and stories, using the exploration process to get better and better at communicating narrative abstractions. An ISFP is going to stay in the more likely stay in the world of the tangible, and so that ends up being music. It ends up being some sort of sensory communication, right? That is nonverbal. Now, I have seen ISFPs be extraordinary athletes. All right, and they're communicating an emotional experience through their athleticism. They'll do it through dance or interpretive dance, or they'll do it by just being amazing, an amazing. I don't know. I mean, name an athletic. Name any sort of sport, and they can take and funnel that emotional experience of what they want. Right? They'll get their heart set on it, just like an INFP will. They'll combine that feeling of what they want with that ability to be totally viscerally in the moment and to utilize their body as a machine, right? To utilize their body as, just another piece of, or another tool for art, another tool for expression, another tool for getting and showing people what is possible with the human body. Now, what's interesting about this type is that they are, here's another thing, actually, before I move on to that piece. I do want to say the other piece is that ISFPs can be some of the most religious of all the types. Now, it's usually the feeling primaries, okay? So who are the feeling primaries? Enemies leading with authenticity or harmony. It's usually the feeling primaries that are the most or the most represented in religion. And maybe I shouldn't use the word religion. Maybe I should say spirituality. Not even so much about, traditional religion as it is about having a spiritual component, because the feeling processes don't require as many data points in order to believe something to be true. They've just got to feel it internally. When they have a connection to something spiritual or divine, it's very difficult for them to waver from that. And so ISFPs, they don't have to be spiritual or religious. However, they do tend to be fairly represented in religions and in spirituality. And that includes INFPs. INFPs usually have a very strong spiritual or religious component to them. And we'll talk about how the harmony drivers are the same. That said, when they become spiritual or when they become religious, regardless of what it looks like, and the INFPs as well, they generally incorporate that so powerfully inside of them that they become missionaries of some sort. Now, that doesn't mean that they all are like, your standard missionary for whatever is the highest religious demographic in your particular country, right? That doesn't mean that they're necessarily missionaries for that, although they could be. But it's more that they're missionaries for a cause, all right? And INFPs and ISFPs both have that reluctant hero component. They both have that missionary for a cause piece to them. So oftentimes, if they do become artists, they're not just artists, they're missionaries. And oftentimes their art is, in some extension to them, a reflection of the divine. Now, what's fascinating about ISFPs is that of all of the types, they hate personality profiling the most of all the types. Every once in a while, you'll get an ISFP that goes, oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, that really told me something about myself. And then they'll start to pursue it. So there is a percentage of ISFPs that like personality typology, but most of them hate it at first sight. And if they can't get beyond the hate at first sight piece, you will not get them interested. The personality type that is the least to go to our website and take our test, the two that are the least likely are ISTPs and ISFPs. But ISTPs, even though they're not likely to pursue it, if you sit down and explain it to them, their machine mind or their systems mind gets how it might work. All right. Now, it might not be interesting to them. They might not be into it. They might go, that's interesting. Yeah, that's fine for you. But they won't full sail reject it. They won't be like, that's offensive. An ISFP will be offended by personality typology. And the reason why is because when they go inside to authenticity, they see the full gambit of who they are. They see themselves in all arrays. And there is no way that a personality profiling system, there's no way that personality types could ever possibly understand them on that level. Okay, there's too much complexity inside of a human being. There's too much there that a personality profiling system could ever possibly explain. Now, when you combine authenticity with exploration is more comfortable with frameworks and models, right? It's more, aerial view. It pattern recognizes, right? Exploration is about what ifs and pattern recognition, and a series of psychological types is all about patterns, right? You see patterns emerging in people. You see patterns emerging in just yourself. So an INFP most INFPs really like personality types. They actually really enjoy it. But ISFPs hate them because they see their complexity. They see the full array of who they are inside because they're quite introspective, but they're not pairing it with an ability to pattern recognize. They're pairing it with what they see in the outer world, with what their sensation is telling them. So they have a tendency to think that personality types are bunk. They can't possibly explain it. Now, what you'll experience if you end up typing or profiling an ISFP is that every single question you ask them, if it's forced choice, meaning do you do this or do you do this, every single one they'll say, I do both. I do both. I do both. I do both. Both. Yeah, I do both of those things. Yeah, and you'll say, are you good at this or this? Oh, I'm good at both of them. Do you have a tendency to do this or do you have a tendency to do that? Oh, I do both of those, right? And it's not that they're trying to mess you up. It's not that they're trying to break the system. It's that their authenticity process truly can find both of those things inside of them. And they're not pattern recognizing. An INFP will go, well, I do both, but I more often do this, because they're pattern recognizing their own behavior. An ISFP isn't pattern recognizing. I just do both. I just know, even if they only do that one thing or only did it once in their life ever, and the other option they do every single moment of every day, they still do both, because they can see both of those inside of them. There's a phrase that I have heard a lot of authenticity people use, in particular INFPs, and that is the expression, I can find that, right? Like if you give them feedback that says, I find that you're being, or I see that you're being really antagonistic or angry, even if they aren't being antagonistic and angry most of the time, they'll say, yeah, I can find that. I can find how inside of myself I could be antagonistic or angry. I can see that. Well, because they can see it, because authenticity can find those parts of them inside of themselves, now they are that thing. Okay, that's part of their identity. Now they are both of those things truly. And because a profiling system requires pattern recognition, all right, because it requires you to be able to, piece apart the thing you did once versus the thing you do constantly and see them as distinct, okay, ISFPs don't resonate with that as much because, well, I did that thing that once, so I can do that, so I am that, all right? So that's one of the reasons why ISFPs are not fans of personality profiling when it comes to them. Now, on the flip side, their 10-year-old process is perspectives, and this gives them an interesting intrigue into psychology. Now, it's not uncommon for authenticity drivers to want to be right, okay? They want to be right, and that's because they're IPs, it's rightness in the firm model. And just like an INFP will skip exploration because they want to keep their idealism and go to memory, which is comforting, right? They'll usually just kind of stay in their homes, and that's how they evidence that. An ISFP will miss sensation, which means that they don't want to interact with the real world. They don't want to engage in experience that will persuade them to believe something else. So they'll skip that and go to the perspectives 10-year-old, and they'll start pattern recognizing inside their own mind and speculating on what's actually going on in the world. So like an ISTP might do this and create some sort of conspiracy around it. ISFPs will do a very similar thing. Now, I know of, I'm not gonna be super specific about how this person does it, but I know an ISFP who has decided to demonize a certain demographic in the United States, right? They've decided that demographic is completely wrong. It doesn't match their authenticity ideals. And whenever they refer to that person, they always end with the word agenda, all right? So that demographic has an agenda. And I've asked them, how often do you hang out with people of that demographic? How often are you chilling out with them? And they won't, right? They were like, oh, well, I've known people like that. But they actually don't and never really have hung out with them, because that would be sensation. That would mean that they would have to engage and interact with that person in real time, and they know that would persuade them. They know that would be persuasive enough that they would have to turn that person from a concept into a human. And they don't want to do that. They don't want to see them as a real person. They want to see them as a concept and continue to pattern recognize about what that demographic is doing and call it an agenda. So that's what happens if they go to their 10-year-old, is they agendize things, right? It's like a conspiracy. It's like ISTPs in the conspiracy theories, or my mate is cheating on me. But generally, this is anything that offends their authenticity process that they do not want to reevaluate. So ISFPs, their superpower is in art, okay? Their superpower is in helping other people replicate emotional experiences so that we can get inside ourselves and ask what's really going on for us. But if they're not doing that, if they're not creating an art that will allow other people to understand themselves on a more fleshed out level, then what they end up doing is they end up going to perspectives as opposed to acting it out through a sensation. They go to perspectives, and then they demonize anybody that doesn't agree with their authenticity process. And then obviously there's all sorts of terrible things that come from that. Not terrible things, but usually they just end up prejudice. Now, the thing about, let's see, where am I at on the ISFP? I want to make sure that I cover that part about them not liking personality profiling. Their 10-year-old will oftentimes show up as an enjoyment of psychology. And when an ISFP gets into personality typology, they like it as a tool that they get to use, but they don't like it being turned back on themselves. However, the more their sensation sees that's actually going on, a lot of times they'll understand that personality types are actually quite useful, and it's a really great tool for not just understanding other people, but for understanding themselves too. So I don't want to indicate that ISFPs will never be into typology. It's just if you end up profiling somebody and you're starting to see these patterns come up, like they're saying they're good at everything and they're saying yes to everything, and I'm feeling some attitude from them, that very much could, I mean, tag that you probably are talking to an ISFP. All right, so how does the 3-year-old show up? Very similar to INFPs. The 3-year-old shows up as pouting, demanding, getting frustrated. Generally, effectiveness shows up as trying to make something happen. And the healthy alternative is to throw themselves into a simple project, just like an INFP would, clear your to-do list, etc. Now, one thing that I've noticed with both INFPs and ISFPs, less so with INFPs, if they have coupled with another person that will help them get their job done. Authenticity drivers can be quite controlling. This is part of that polarity, right? You can't completely separate one from the other. They can be quite controlling when it comes to their art. All right. Now, effectiveness is usually considered the controlling process, but authenticity can be very controlling as a driver because it really, I mean, this is my personal expression. This is me expressing myself. So when it comes to this piece of art, I want to be able to have control over everything. And the effectiveness piece will come up if their authenticity driver is not convincing other people to do it the way that they want their art to be done. And then they're the artists that absolutely throw the worst temper tantrums and just lose their minds on the people around them, are super controlling of absolutely every tiny little thing. That's the stereotype of the artist, right? The fussy artist that needs everything their way. Usually they're ISFPs because they're trying to represent themselves authentically, and other people are not them, and they can't do everything, although they would if they could. And the only way they can try to get other people to be convinced that they need to do it this way is to demand it. Generally, if they do enough sensation, though, if they're open enough to collaborate, or if they're open enough to be able to, you know, like see that there are other alternative ways of doing it, or hear other people's ways of doing it, they're usually more open and they're less demanding of everything being their own way. And one thing you have to watch out for ISFPs and INFPs is that they're suspicious of systems. A lot of times they'll say that they love, here it's just crazy, authenticity people will say that they love plans and planning, and they love systems. But buyer beware. What they really like is when things are not contradicting what they want, all right? If you implement a system that they don't understand, they will go about systematically breaking it. Okay, they will try to break the system. Now, they won't consciously do it. It's totally unconscious. We're talking about the left side of the car, so all this is unconscious, but they will unconsciously start breaking those systems. So if you end up using this in coaching or consulting in business, look out for anybody who's breaking systems. They're probably an ISFP, and it's a matter of them getting out of the 3-year-old and into the co-pilot and making sure that they're collaborating with people and co-creating an experience, and then delegating anything that isn't their particular strength. Same thing with an INFP. And it's the same as an accuracy driver, breaking social systems, going in and being deliberately obnoxious in a social setting, like burping and farting and going, what's the problem? It's very similar, only instead of its social systems, it's other systems, it's effectiveness systems. All right, so there's a superpower here. The superpower is impossibly being the best artist on the planet, and with great power comes great responsibility. So just make sure that you're doing the artistic version and not the the monster that breaks system version. All right, so those are the IPs. Those are the 4 introverted perceiver types, and you can see how they really want to be right, and you can see how that would manifest. The subjective nature of their introverted judging process makes them really hate this feeling of self-doubt, and especially for authenticity, self-doubt can be rampant. So the more the person is fearing self-doubt, the more that they're probably going to double down on the rightness, and the more wrong they're going to be. So really encouraging people to be open to being wrong, to being open to information and test iterating is one of the best ways to get people to a healthy position. All right, so now let's talk about the last style in the firm model, the management style, or the EJs. We're going to talk about extroverted judgers next.